Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are attempting something pretty massive, a huge mission, really.
I think that's putting it lightly.
We're going to try and traverse the complete, detailed history of Germany. And look, this isn't a quick skim. We're talking about millennia here.
Right.
From the ancient tribes clashing with the Roman Empire, through the whole medieval melting pot, the rise and fall of these great empires, world-shattering catastrophes, and into the complex modern process of reunification.
It's arguably the most politically and geographically fluid national history in all of Europe.
Absolutely.
And because the scope is so immense, we have to be absolutely rigorous about the chronology, focusing on these really defining eras. The sources we've synthesized are just incredible in their detail.
And that's our mission today, right? To focus on how the very identity of Germany was built, then shattered, then rebuilt, often, quite violently.
Exactly. We have to extract those key moments of convergence, of division, and then ultimately of resurgence.
And I think the most fascinating place to start is before Germany even really existed as a concept we'd recognize. It starts with, of all things, Roman map making.
Right, the origin of the name. It's famously not something that came from the people living there.
It was an external label.
It was. The term Germania was essentially coined by Julius Caesar. So when he was consolidating Roman power in Gaul, what we call modern France, he needed a name for the area to the east.
The unconquered part.
The unconquered and militarily resistant area east of the Rhine River. He called it Germania. So it was defined for the very beginning by what it was not.
It wasn't Gaul. It wasn't Roman.
Precisely. It was distinct from the lands the Romans had already subjugated. And this idea, this concept of an eastern frontier, becomes the critical starting point for, well, the next 1,000 years of history.
Okay, so let's unpack this earliest era. This German identity, defined right at the start by its resistance to Rome, it seems to owe almost everything to one single pivotal battle.
The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 89.
Yes, that one sounds foundational.
It was absolutely foundational. It was just a massive, catastrophic defeat for the Roman legions, and it was engineered by a Cherusci chieftain named Arminius.
And he wasn't just some random tribal leader, right? He had a history with Rome.
That's the critical part. Arminius had actually served in the Roman army. He gained Roman citizenship, and most importantly, he became intimately familiar with Roman tactical doctrines, their formations, their discipline.
And he knew their playbook inside and out.
Exactly. And he used this knowledge to lure 3 entire Roman legions, led by Publius Quintilius Varus, into an ambush in the dense forest. He completely and decisively defeated them.
So this wasn't just a loss of men and equipment. This was a psychological blow, a strategic failure that really changed Rome's entire ambition in Central Europe.
It completely halted the Roman Empire's annexation efforts east of the Rhine. The Emperor Augustus, it's recorded, was so deeply shaken by the loss, he would supposedly bang his head against the wall, crying out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions."
Wow. So Rome was basically forced to draw a hard, permanent line in the sand after that.
A very hard line. And that line became the definitive border for centuries.
So what were the physical and political consequences of drawing that line? What did it look like on the ground?
Well, Rome decided to permanently establish the Rhine and Danube rivers as their frontier. So by about AD 100, they formalized this with something called the Limes Germanicus.
And that was a wall.
It was a massive system of forts, watchtowers, palisades, and sometimes earthen walls, a huge defensive network. And this border physically split the region. To the west, you had the Roman provinces of Germania Superior and Germania Inferior.
And to the east?
To the east of the Rhine lay what they called Germania, Magna Great Germany, the unconquered territory where the tribes remained completely independent of any Roman rule.
And this distinction, this line, it's so crucial because it dictates the spread of early cultural influences, especially something as important as Christianity.
Precisely. Christianity arrived in the Roman-controlled western part of Germania well before the Middle Ages even began. We see physical evidence, actual structures showing established Christian life inside those Western Romanized areas, long before the faith ever moved east.
What kind of evidence are we talking about?
A great example is the Alla Palatina of Trier. It was a massive basilica built during the reign of Constantine I in the early 4th century. It shows you that there was established Roman administrative and, very likely, religious life happening under imperial direction.
So the West was culturally and politically tethered to Rome, but the East was completely separate.
Completely. A different world.
Okay, so once the Western Roman Empire eventually collapses, there's a huge political vacuum. And the Franks, who were a West Germanic tribe themselves, they're the ones who step in to fill it.
Yes, and this is where the political structure that eventually gives rise to Germany truly begins to take shape.
The Frankish Empire is the crucible then.
It is, and its interaction with the church was incredibly rapid and strategically decisive. The key political shift happens when Pippin III, who was the mayor of the palace, he successfully seizes the title of king in 751.
But he needs to legitimize that, right? He's a usurper.
He does. And to legitimize this overthrow of the old Merovingian dynasty, he was anointed by the church. Pope Stephen II later gave him the hereditary title Patricius Romanorum, Protector of the Romans, in 754.
So this gave his dynasty a divine mandate to rule.
A divine mandate. And that sanction from the church didn't just legitimize the dynasty, it completely set the stage for Pippin's son, Charlemagne, to expand his dominion, both violently and religiously.
Let's talk about Charlemagne's campaigns. The sources describe them as relentless.
Relentless is the right word. They lasted for over 3 decades, from 772 to 804, and they were especially brutal against the Franks' main pagan rivals, the Saxons and the Avars.
The Saxon wars in particular sound like a real slog.
They were. They were characterized by constant insurrections, forced conversions at sword point, and mass deportations. Charlemagne's approach was essentially conversion by the sword. He annexed their lands into this vast, unified, and now thoroughly Christianized Carolingian empire.
So he created this massive unified Christian empire, but that unity was, as you said, temporary.
Very temporary, and history so often hinges on this kind of fragmentation. The pivotal moment for establishing a recognizably German state comes from the division of this vast Carolingian empire.
Right, after Charlemagne's death.
Yes. In 843, his grandsons divided the empire with the Treaty of Verdun. The eastern third of that empire became known as East Francia, and that kingdom very rapidly transitioned into what was later known as the Kingdom of Germany.
So that's the seed.
That's the seed. And this new realm was further solidified and defined in 962 when Otto I, who was a really powerful Saxon duke, became the first Holy Roman Emperor.
And his coronation by the Pope, that's the official starting point.
It marks the effective beginning of the medieval German state, the Holy Roman Empire, or the HRE.
So, okay, if 843 gave us East Francia and 962 gave us the Holy Roman Empire, we now have a political entity. But it's famously not a unified state. It's very decentralized.
Precisely. That is the key thing to understand about the HRE. It was never a unified nation-state in the modern sense. It was a sprawling, decentralized structure made up of hundreds of different principalities, bishoprics, and free cities.
All theoretically bound to the emperor.
Theoretically. But its long existence would be defined by this constant tension between the emperor's attempt at central authority and the growing autonomy of all these regional rulers.
Okay, so while the political center is weak, this is where the economic and geographic expansion begins in earnest, and that starts shaping the future German identity in a different way.
Yes, and we need to talk about the power of commerce here, specifically the Hanseatic League.
The Hansa.
The Hansa. What's so fascinating is how this economic organization provided a kind of cohesion where political unity was completely failing. The Hanseatic League rose to just dominate trade on the Baltic and North Seas. It essentially became this powerful commercial federation.
So it wasn't a state, but it acted like one?
It wasn't a state, no. It was a network of these northern port cities like Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen. And they exercised enormous economic and, frankly, political influence. They controlled trade in everything from salt and grain to timber and furs.
And they could project power.
They often acted as a unified political power. They even waged war to protect their interests. It demonstrates this very specific kind of decentralized, urban-centric German power projection.
At the same time, the geographic focus is shifting northeast, and it's driven by a mix of military, religious, and economic motives. We're talking about the Northern Crusades.
That's right. And this expansion led to the establishment of the state of the Teutonic Order right along the southern Baltic coast. And this was not a regular kingdom.
It was a religious state.
It was a monastic state, a military order of knights who pledged allegiance to both the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. Their stated mission was to convert the remaining pagan Prussians, Lithuanians, and Livonians in the region.
The sources are pretty clear that the Teutonic Order's methods were merciless. They controlled this huge territory that eventually becomes the core of Prussia, Latvia, and Estonia.
Their conquest was brutally enforced, and it involved these massive demographic shifts. They would build military fortifications and then bring in German settlers, radically altering the ethnic and religious makeup of the entire region.
And the local populations, they didn't just accept this.
They resisted fiercely. After a major defeat for the Knights at the Battle of Durb in 1260, a huge rebellion known as the Great Prussian Uprising began, and it lasted for a grueling 23 years.
23 years of continuous resistance. That shows you the depth of the opposition. What was the ultimate consequence?
In the end, the resistance just slowly withered away. It was crushed by the superior organization and, frankly, the endless resources of the order. The result was a tragic demographic and cultural shift.
How so?
While many of the indigenous Prussians either emigrated or were forcibly baptized, the old Prussian lifestyle, their language, it was all gradually replaced by German culture and the German language as more and more German migrants flooded into these newly conquered regions.
So this history of expansion and, well, brutal demographic replacement, that's the foundation upon which Prussia and later modern Germany was built.
It is the absolute foundation, yes.
So if expansion defined the external dynamic, the internal political life was defined by this massive conflict between the spiritual and secular leaders, the church and the emperor. You mentioned the investiture controversy earlier. Can we explain why this, very technical-sounding dispute over clerical appointments mattered so much?
Oh, it was everything. The investiture controversy was the fight over who the Pope or the Emperor had the right to appoint bishops and other high clergy.
And in the HRE, bishops weren't just religious figures.
Not at all. Bishops often controlled large, powerful territories. They had their own armies, their own tax revenues. So if the emperor could appoint them, he maintained political control over those lands. When Pope Gregory II decreed that only the church could invest clergy with their office, the German Emperor Henry IV resisted fiercely.
And this led to a pretty dramatic humiliation for the emperor.
Yes, a famous moment in history. Henry IV was excommunicated, which was a political death sentence at the time. He was forced to make a dramatic walk of penance to Canossa in 1077 in the snow to beg for the Pope's forgiveness.
So the Pope won.
In that instance, yes.
Yeah.
And although Henry eventually regained some power, the controversy fundamentally weakened the central imperial authority for good. By the late Middle Ages, this struggle and others like it allowed the regional dukes, the princes, and the bishops to permanently gain political and territorial power at the expense of the emperors.
So the HRE becomes this mosaic of increasingly autonomous states, making the idea of a unified German identity politically impossible.
Utterly impossible. The fragmentation was locked in.
Okay, so if the fragmentation of the Middle Ages was political, the early modern period brings a religious revolution, and right after that, a catastrophic civil war. Let's pivot to Martin Luther.
Luther is the ideological pivot point of modern German history. He initiates changes that just irrevocably split the region. When he published his 95 Theses in 1517, his focus on condemning the excessive sale of indulgences and clerical offices, it struck an immediate nerve with the populace.
And it secured him wide popular support, right?
Immediately.
But this wasn't just some theological argument happening in university. The sources make it really clear this was a media revolution, and it was powered by the printing press.
The printing press turned a regional debate into a continental movement. It was the internet of its day. From 1517 onward, religious pamphlets, broadsheets, treatises, they just flooded the German territories.
Do we have a sense of the numbers?
We do. By 1530, historians estimate that over 10,000 individual works were published, and that generated a colossal 10 million copies in total. This was just unprecedented information dissemination.
But it was all focused on the German territories.
Entirely, which enabled the Reformation's incredibly rapid spread.
And Luther's Bible translation played a huge role, not just in theology, but in, unifying the language itself.
Absolutely. Yeah. His translation of the Bible into High German, the New Testament, in 1522, and the whole thing was completed in 1534, that was perhaps the single most decisive impulse for increasing literacy across all the German lands.
How so?
By bypassing Latin and all the existing local dialects, he essentially codified a form of Standard High German that was accessible across the central and northern territories. So it unified the language even as it was shattering the religious unity of Christendom.
And this resulting schism, the Protestant North and East versus the Catholic South and West, it laid the groundwork for the most destructive conflict in German history, the 30 Years' War.
The 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648, was an existential catastrophe. It started as a conflict between Catholic and Protestant states within the HRE, but it rapidly drew in all the major European powers. It became this protracted struggle for political dominance over Central Europe, and it was fought almost entirely on German soil.
I think we need to spend a moment on the sheer human cost, because the figures are just staggering. They seem to surpass the relative destruction of even World War II in some areas.
The destruction it was localized but tremendous. The overall population decline in the German areas of the HRE is estimated at a shocking 40%,
40%.
falling from roughly 18 to 20 million people
Uh,
down to between 11 and 13 million by 1650. The destruction was so intense that some villages were completely wiped off the map, suffering 90% or even higher mortality rates.
And it took a full century for the population to recover to pre-war levels. That single fact just underscores the magnitude of the disaster.
It truly does. Pre-war levels were not regained until 1750. When we talk about historical memory and trauma, the 30 Years' War embedded this deep-seated fear of civil conflict and external intervention that colored German politics for centuries to come.
So what was the definitive political outcome that finally stopped this tide of destruction?
The Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Critically, the treaty granted great autonomy, almost sovereignty, to the individual estates of the empire. The emperor's power was severely and permanently curtailed.
So after Westphalia, the HRE is definitively recognized as just a loose confederation of hundreds of independent or semi-independent states.
Exactly. And within that, 4 states, Austria, Prussia, Bavaria, and Saxony, emerged as the most powerful players. And that set the stage for the competition that would eventually lead to German unification.
So following Westphalia, the next century sees the meteoric and seemingly unstoppable rise of Prussia centered there in Berlin-Brandenburg.
Yes, and this era is characterized by something called enlightened absolutism, where the ruler claims to govern rationally, for the people's benefit.
And Prussia really perfected this model.
It developed into a true military administrative state. It achieved this rapid centralization where the Holy Roman Empire had completely failed. And the key figure here, of course, is Frederick II, known as Frederick the Great.
He's the quintessential enlightened despot.
He is. He combined this high culture and philosophy with just ruthless military ambition.
His military genius was pretty undeniable, often when he was facing huge odds.
Oh, absolutely. His defining test was the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763. He was facing this huge coalition that included Austria, France, and Russia.
He was completely outnumbered.
Vastly. But despite the immense numerical disadvantage, he achieved these stunning victories. Most notably against the French and Austrians at Rossbach in November 1757, and then he quickly followed that with the victory over Austria at Leuthen in December. Prussia suffered grievously. It nearly collapsed. But Frederick's genius ensured its survival and established its reputation as a dominant European military power.
But his military power was matched by this domestic transformation. How did he apply his Enlightenment ideals to the home front?
He was highly practical. After the devastation of the wars, he worked diligently to rebuild the economy and agriculture. This included establishing trade relations with the brand new United States and initiating crucial agricultural reforms.
It was potato, right?
Most famously, by forcing his populace to adopt the potato and the turnip as staple crops. It seemed small, but it dramatically improved food security. He saw the state as a single, rational machine working for the benefit of its citizens and, of course, for his own rule.
And geopolitically, he made the one move that secured Prussia's core territory.
The first partition of Poland in 1772. It was a masterpiece of cynical, pragmatic diplomacy. Frederick orchestrated this division alongside Austria and Russia.
And what did Prussia get out of it?
This allowed him to annex Polish Prussia, which was the crucial land bridge he needed to connect his scattered Brandenburg-Berlin territory with his other western lands. This territorial cohesion was absolutely vital. And having secured this, he formally upgraded his title from King in Prussia to King of Prussia, asserting full control and separating himself definitively from the old HRE hierarchy.
Okay, so Prussia's ascendancy is immediately challenged by this new force erupting from Napoleon's revolutionary armies. French expansion acted like a wrecking ball on the old German order.
A revolutionary wrecking ball. Napoleon just reorganized much of the German territory. He swept away feudalism, established modern civil codes. And in 1806, when he formed the Confederation of the Rhine, he demanded that Emperor Francis II renounce his title.
And that was it, the end of the Holy Roman Empire.
That was the formal dissolution of the 1,000-year-old Holy Roman Empire. The political map of Europe was wiped clean.
And the sources show that Prussia, despite its fearsome military reputation, was just utterly humbled by Napoleon.
Humbled is the right word. King Frederick William III rashly joined the Fourth Coalition in 1806, only to be easily and swiftly defeated by Napoleon at the twin battles of Jena and Auerstedt.
And Berlin was occupied?
Berlin was occupied. Prussia was forced to cede significant Western territories, pay massive reparations, and, most tellingly, its army was severely limited to just 42,000 men. It was a profound trauma that necessitated deep, deep internal reform in the Prussian state and military.
So after Napoleon's final defeat, the old powers try to put everything back together at the Congress of Vienna.
Yes, in 1815 they established the German Confederation, but this was a very loose association of 39 German states. It was really intended just to keep a balance between the two big powers, Austria and Prussia.
And it was placed under Austrian presidency.
It was, which reflected a temporary return to an Austrian-led balance of power, but it fundamentally lacked the institutions needed for any kind of true national cohesion. It was a stopgap.
Which brings us to the 19th century, and this is perhaps the most transformative period in this entire deep dive. It's characterized by this fundamental tension. Rapid, sweeping modernization happening underneath a rigid, politically stagnant surface.
Absolutely. The Industrial Revolution modernized the German economy at just breakneck speed, particularly in places like the Ruhr and Saxony. This led to rapid urban growth, which created a whole new class dynamic and the emergence of the socialist movement.
The working class organized around new political demands.
Exactly. Demands for economic justice and suffrage. The old political structure of the Confederation was simply not equipped to handle this kind of dynamism.
And meanwhile, intellectual life was just exploding.
German universities became world-class centers for science and the humanities. You have figures like Hermann von Helmholtz defining physics and physiology, Justus von Liebig revolutionizing chemistry.
And in the humanities, the brothers Grimm.
Right, working on their monumental Deutsches Wörterbuch, the German dictionary. They weren't just collecting fairy tales. They were actively defining and establishing the very foundations of German studies and philology. There was this powerful, educated desire for a unified national state that would reflect this intellectual and economic strength.
But the Confederation remained under this dual Austrian-Prussian dominance, which leads directly to the 1848 revolutions.
The revolutions of 1848 were a pivotal, liberal attempt to achieve unification from below, from the people. On May 18, 1848, the first all-German parliament, the Frankfurt National Assembly, it assembled in St. Paul's Church.
And who were these people?
They were elected members from across the German states, and their mission was clear: draft a liberal constitution and form a unified German nation-state. They spent months debating whether it should be a Greater Germany, including Austria, or a Lesser Germany, excluding Austria.
And despite all this democratic deliberation, the entire revolution failed because of one single refusal.
It failed because the King of Prussia, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, refused the imperial crown that was offered to him by the assembly.
Why?
He famously stated that he would not accept a crown from the gutter. He was completely unwilling to accept the political limitations, the reduction of his monarchical power that was imposed by the constitution they had drafted. And frankly, he also knew that accepting the crown would immediately trigger a war with Austria, which he wasn't prepared to fight.
So the liberal democratic path to unification just died right there. And this created a political vacuum that only military force, orchestrated by one man, could fill.
Otto von Bismarck. He was made minister-president of Prussia in 1862. He was conservative, a total realpolitiker, and he famously announced to the Budgetary Committee that the great questions of the day would not be decided by speeches and majority resolutions. That was the mistake of 1848, but by iron and blood.
And he immediately started engineering the necessary military conflicts to achieve that.
His first move was the Danish War of 1864. He fought it alongside Austria over the administration of the Schleswig-Holstein territory. They won quickly, but then the subsequent division of the conquered land created the precise administrative argument that Bismarck needed to pick a fight with Austria.
He was setting them up.
Completely. And that led directly to the showdown.
The Austro-Prussian War of 1866.
A war designed by Bismarck for one purpose: to expel Austria from German affairs permanently. It lasted only 7 weeks and was decided by the decisive Prussian victory at the Battle of Königgrätz. It just demonstrated the superior organization and deployment of the Prussian army.
And what was the immediate political effect of that victory?
The old German Confederation led by Austria was dissolved. It was immediately replaced by the new Prussian-dominated North German Confederation. The stage was set, Austria was out, Prussia was the unquestioned leader, and the final steps toward a unified German empire were now inevitable.
So the final crucial step to full unification came through the Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 1871, which, again, Bismarck skillfully provoked.
Yes, and the conflict was quickly decided in Prussia's favor. It led to the capture of the French Emperor, Napoleon III himself. And the proclamation of the German Empire was then orchestrated by Bismarck on January 18, 1871.
In a deliberately provocative location.
The most provocative location imaginable, the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles.
That location was a profound statement. It was declaring a unified German dominance right in the historic heart of the French monarchy.
It was a conscious, calculated humiliation of France. France was forced to pay massive indemnities, and, critically, they had to cede the territory of Alsace-Lorraine. And this act established a deep-seated French desire for revenge, that would poison European diplomacy for the next 40 years.
And what did the new German Empire look like?
It was a federal structure with a central emperor, the Kaiser, and a chancellor. It had an elected parliament, the Reichstag, but that parliament held very limited power compared to the executive government run by the chancellor.
And as chancellor, Bismarck was the architect of the empire's early stability. Notably, through the creation of what we now recognize as the first modern welfare state.
His approach was highly pragmatic. It's often described as a kind of state socialism, but it was designed to combat the rising appeal of the actual socialist parties.
So it's a political tool.
Absolutely. Building on earlier Prussian traditions, Bismarck introduced old-age pensions, accident insurance, medical care, and unemployment insurance throughout the 1880s. This was the very foundation of the modern European welfare model.
And why did he do this? Was it purely humanitarian?
No, his motivation was explicitly political and strategic. First, to win the massive, burgeoning working-class support away from the socialist movement, thereby securing their loyalty to his empire.
And
Second, to reduce the substantial outflow of German immigrants to America. By providing a basic social safety net, he made staying in Germany economically more viable, which helped retain vital labor resources for Germany's booming industries.
Besides domestic politics, Bismarck also engaged in these intense ideological struggles and, of course, colonial expansion.
Domestically, there was the Kulturkampf, the cultural struggle, which was his campaign against the political influence of the Catholic Church, which he saw as a potential source of disloyalty after unification.
And externally?
Externally, Germany established colonies, but very late in the game. In Africa, places like Cameroon, Namibia, Tanzania, and in the Pacific, like Papua New Guinea. This was driven partly by economic interest, but mostly by the need to demonstrate that Germany was now a major world power and deserved its place in the sun alongside Britain and France.
But Bismarck was dismissed in 1890 by the new Kaiser, Wilhelm II. And Wilhelm II inherited this massive, booming nation, a global center for science and industry. But his personal ambition and his aggressive foreign policy rapidly destabilized all of Europe.
Wilhelm II was determined to prove Germany's greatness. And to him, that meant challenging Britain's maritime supremacy, which is the one thing Bismarck had always warned against doing.
So this military buildup deeply concerned Britain, France, and Russia.
It did. It eventually solidified them into the Triple Entente by 1907. Germany, meanwhile, remained locked into the Triple Alliance with Austria, Hungary, and Italy. And this rigid interlocking alliance structure made it so a localized conflict was nearly impossible to contain.
The naval arms race with Britain is the clearest example of this misplaced aggression.
It was a massive strategic blunder. After Bismarck was dismissed, the Anglo-German naval arms race began. Germany invested enormous resources into building a high-seas fleet. However, the launch of HMS Dreadnought by the British in 1906, a radically new, turbine-powered battleship, it immediately made every single existing German battleship obsolete.
So Germany spent a fortune chasing a technology that Britain could always outpace.
Precisely. Germany committed massive resources to a navy that was large enough only to antagonize Britain, but never large enough to actually defeat the Royal Navy. By 1911, the German chancellor had to admit the naval race was unwinnable.
So they shifted strategy.
Yes, it led to the Rüstungswende, a strategic policy shift where expenditure was moved dramatically from the Navy back to the Army, focusing on continental land power. But by then, the damage to diplomatic relations with Britain was already done.
And the diplomatic powder keg finally ignited in the Balkans.
The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914 by a Serbian nationalist triggered the pre-programmed alliance system. After Austria-Hungary's aggressive response to Serbia, Germany gave them the infamous blank check of support.
And it all cascaded from there.
Germany declared war on Russia and then France. Germany's strategic decision to invade neutral Belgium to execute the Schlieffen Plan brought the United Kingdom into the war. By August, all of Europe was engulfed in flames.
The initial German reaction in 1914 was characterized by the spirit of 1914, this enthusiastic, almost naive, widespread support for the war.
Yes, especially among the educated middle classes. They really hoped for a quick, decisive victory.
But that illusion shattered completely.
It did. The initial German advance into France was halted at the Battle of the Marne. The war then rapidly devolved into this static, horrific trench warfare that stretched from the English Channel all the way to Switzerland. Machine guns and artillery dominated the battlefield, grinding all movement to a halt.
And this kind of war necessitated total mobilization on the home front, which fundamentally altered civilian life.
The 1916 Hindenburg Program formalized this total mobilization. It called for the use of all economic resources, labor, raw materials, industry, to sustain the war effort. Everything was subordinated to the military machine.
Even church bells.
Church bells, copper roofs, pots and pans, they were all melted down for materials. And the civilian population suffered acutely due to the Allied naval blockade and the prioritization of military supply lines.
What was the human toll on the civilian population inside Germany during the war?
It was severe. Germany saw 474,000 excess civilian deaths above peacetime levels. This was primarily due to severe food shortages and malnutrition, which dramatically weakened people's resistance to diseases like the Spanish flu.
And the blockade continued even after the fighting stopped.
Crucially, yes. About 71,000 of those deaths occurred in the first half of 1919, while the Allied blockade, which was being used as a negotiation tool, remained in effect even after the armistice was signed.
Militarily, despite the deadlock, the Germans did introduce some fascinating new tactics.
They pioneered the use of elite stormtroops, or Stormtrooper. These were carefully selected, highly trained soldiers taught entirely new infiltration tactics.
How did that work?
Sudden, fierce artillery barrages, followed by small mobile units armed with light machine guns who would bypass strong enemy points and head directly for command posts and artillery batteries deep behind the lines. It was a desperate attempt to restore mobility to the static front.
But it wasn't enough.
No. They lacked sufficient motorized transport, dive bombers, or tanks. They could create local breakthroughs, but they couldn't exploit them into decisive victories. It was a lesson the next generation of German commanders learned very well.
And the war didn't end with a great Allied breakthrough on the Western Front, but with an internal political collapse in Germany.
Exactly. The German Revolution of 1918-1919 began on November 3, 1918, with a sailors' mutiny at the port of Kiel. They were fueled by starvation and the sense that the war was hopelessly lost.
And it spread.
It spread like wildfire. The mutiny led to the declaration of a republic on November 9. Emperor Wilhelm II, having lost the support of his own military command, was forced to abdicate, and he fled to the Netherlands. The new civilian government signed the armistice just days later.
Which brings us to the Weimar Republic. The new German Republic, established in the city of Weimar, immediately inherited the responsibility for ending the war and dealing with the consequences, the first and biggest being the Treaty of Versailles in 1919.
For most Germans, the treaty was seen as a harsh, politically humiliating diktat, a dictated peace imposed by the Allies. Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, required Germany to accept all responsibility for the damages caused by the war.
And that clause provided the legal justification for setting massive reparations.
Yes, and those reparations were economically crippling. They were deliberately set at an unrealistic figure.
How unrealistic?
The liability was set at 132 billion Reichsmarks, payable in gold or commodities. But crucially, Allied experts themselves assessed Germany's actual maximum capacity to pay at only 50 billion gold marks. This unrealistic figure guaranteed chronic instability and fueled widespread, sustained resentment against the Weimar Republic, which was forced to agree to the terms.
And this instability peaked dramatically during the crisis of 1923.
Right. When Germany defaulted on some timber and coal payments, French and Belgian troops occupied the industrial heartland of the Ruhr in January 1923. The German government responded with passive resistance, effectively shutting down all production.
And to pay for this, they started printing money.
They printed money to underwrite the costs of the idled factories and to pay the striking workers. This disastrous policy resulted in the peak of hyperinflation, where banknotes became literally worthless. People were using wheelbarrows of cash to buy a loaf of bread.
The social consequence of that must have been profound.
It was. Many middle-class Germans who relied on savings, pensions, or fixed incomes saw their entire life savings wiped out overnight. These people, suddenly impoverished and deeply embittered, felt completely betrayed by the democratic system. They became radicalized and turned into permanent enemies of the Republic.
Despite this incredible trauma, the Republic did manage to stabilize, at least for a while.
It did. Passive resistance was halted, and a new currency, the Rentenmark, was introduced in November 1923, which successfully ended the hyperinflation. The mid to late 1920s, the so-called Golden Twenties, saw a period of economic recovery. By 1928, industrial production had actually surpassed the 1913 pre-war level.
And this period of stability is exactly why the Nazi Party remained a fringe element.
Precisely. The Nazi Party, founded in 1920, was inherently anti-democratic. It promoted the destruction of the Republic, total rejection of Versailles, radical anti-Semitism, and this need for Lebensraum, or living space.
And during the stable period, that message just didn't resonate.
Not widely, no. In the 1928 Reichstag election, they received only 2.6% of the vote. They secured just 12 seats. They were a marginal extremist joke to most people.
But then the Great Depression, starting in 1929, completely shattered that economic stability and gave Hitler the political opportunity he needed to move from the fringe right into the mainstream.
The economic shock was a catastrophe. Unemployment skyrocketed, which grew public ambivalence toward the parliamentary republic, and it drove voters toward extremist parties on both the left and the right.
And the political landscape changed overnight.
It did. In the September 1930 election, the Nazi Party surged from that 2.6% to 18.3% of the vote. They won 107 seats, becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag.
And this surge immediately broke the governing coalition and began the slide toward authoritarianism, even before Hitler became chancellor.
Absolutely. The moderate parties couldn't form stable majorities anymore. This forced the chancellor, Heinrich Brüning, to govern almost entirely through emergency decrees issued by the elderly President Paul von Hindenburg using Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution.
So governance by decree became the new norm.
It did. And that fundamentally bypassed the Reichstag and paved the way for Hitler to later assume dictatorial powers using the exact same mechanism.
Before we discuss the dictatorship itself, let's briefly look at the architect. Hitler's background is often simplified, but he was an Austrian German.
Yes, and that's key. He became a fervent German nationalist in his youth, and he developed this strong dislike for the ethnically diverse Habsburg monarchy he grew up in. He left school without clear career plans, drifted in Vienna and Munich, and then volunteered for the Bavarian army at the outbreak of World War I, even though he was an Austrian citizen.
And he served during the war.
He served as a dispatch runner, spending about half his time at regimental headquarters behind the immediate front line. He was decorated for bravery, but he remained a completely political and marginal figure until the post-war turmoil gave him an opening.
Okay, so the destruction of the Republic accelerated rapidly after Hitler was appointed chancellor in January 1933. The Reichstag fire was the critical trigger.
On the night of February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building burned down. Hitler and his allies immediately proclaimed the fire was the start of a communist uprising.
And they used that as a pretext.
They used it to pressure Hindenburg into signing the Reichstag fire decree the very next day. This decree was the first legislative step toward dictatorship. It permanently rescinded most civil liberties assembly, press freedom, and it allowed for the indefinite detention of political opponents without any charge. Thousands of communists were immediately arrested.
Just weeks later, the dictatorship was formally established, legally bypassing all the remaining democratic checks.
That was the Enabling Act, passed in March 1933. It gave Hitler and his cabinet the power to enact laws independently, without consulting the president or the Reichstag. It effectively suspended the Constitution.
And the vote was secured through intimidation.
Massive SA or storm detachment, intimidation outside the parliament building. And by excluding the communist deputies who were already in custody, it was the formal legal beginning of Nazi Germany.
The next step was this comprehensive process of Nazifying every single institution, known as Gleichschaltung coordination.
Gleichschaltung began immediately. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service in April 1933 was devastating. It dismissed all Jews and political opponents from every level of government: judges, teachers, university professors, lawyers. Many people who had no political convictions just rushed to join the Nazi Party simply to protect their jobs and their retirement benefits, which just accelerated the regime's control over the state apparatus.
And this coordination extended far beyond the civil service.
It encompassed everything: culture, youth. In September 1933, Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels established the Reich Culture Chamber. This controlled film, press, arts, and literature. Artists and writers had to belong to affiliated bodies to work, and their material required propaganda ministry approval. Unsurprisingly, newspaper readership just plummeted due to the decrease in quality and the pervasive propaganda.
And the youth
For the youth, the Hitler Youth became the sole legal youth group by 1934, and participation was made mandatory by 1939. This ensured that every German child was indoctrinated from a very young age.
The final consolidation of power came swiftly after Hindenburg's death.
When Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler immediately abolished the office of president. He merged its powers with that of chancellor. He firmly became Führer and Reichskanzler, leader and chancellor,
And Supreme Commander.
and Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. This required all servicemen to swear a personal loyalty oath, not to the Constitution, but directly to Hitler himself. The totalitarian state was now complete.
At the core of this state was an ideology explicitly dedicated to territorial conquest and mass murder.
Yes, the ideology, which was clearly detailed in his book Mein Kampf, laid out these plans for vast territorial expansion Lebensraum in the East and a dictatorship based purely on race. It demonized Jews, equating them with germs and international poisoners, and it explicitly pointed toward extermination as the ultimate goal.
The persecution of Jews began immediately and became institutionalized.
Early persecution involved forcing them to retire from the civil service and the legal profession. This all culminated in the Nuremberg Laws of September 1935. These laws formally stripped Jews and other non-Aryans, later extended to Romani and black people of their German citizenship.
So they were no longer citizens.
They were subjects of the state but not citizens. It declared that only those of German or related blood were citizens. It also prohibited sexual relations and marriage between them and Aryans.
And the violence then escalated dramatically.
Kriegsglaubnacht, the state-sanctioned pogrom in 1938, marked a crucial turn toward open, widespread violence. This motivated about half of Germany's 500,000 Jews to flee the country before 1939, when escape became nearly impossible. And what followed was the systematic, industrialized murder of entire groups deemed enemies of the state.
We have to state the horrifying scale of the Holocaust and the genocidal killings.
The Nazi regime systematically murdered around 6 million Jews. Beyond that, the regime targeted and murdered at least 130,000 Romani people, 275,000 disabled people, and millions of political and religious opponents, including Soviet prisoners of war. Historians estimate the Nazi regime was responsible for an estimated 19.3 million genocidal killings of civilians and POWs overall, a deliberate industrial effort to erase entire populations.
And the preparation for World War II was equally methodical.
Hitler had made his intentions clear years earlier. At a meeting in November 1937, which was recorded as the Hossbach Memorandum, he restated his intention of acquiring Lebensraum and ordered war preparations in the East to begin as early as 1938. His view was that military aggression was essential to secure raw materials and land to prevent a severe decline in German living standards.
German forces initially swept across Europe, but the tide turned decisively in the East.
Yes. The definitive turning point was the German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943. That was followed by the massive tank battle at Kursk in the summer of 1943. After Kursk, German territorial gains in the east were mostly lost, and Soviets began their massive counteroffensive that would not stop until they reached Berlin.
Hitler's final strategy and his final orders, they demonstrated an utter contempt for the German populace.
Faced with overwhelming defeat in early 1945, he chose to use his remaining military reserves against the Western Allies in the failed Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, in December 1944.
And his final orders were even more chilling.
On March 19, 1945, recognizing the war was lost, he issued the Nero Decree. This ordered the destruction of all German industrial infrastructure in a scorched earth policy. He completely disregarded the population's needs, stating chillingly that only those who are inferior will remain after this struggle, for the good have already been killed.
But the order wasn't carried out.
His Minister for Armaments, Albert Speer, secretly disobeyed this order to save the infrastructure that would be needed for any future reconstruction.
And his final act came in the bunker in Berlin.
On April 28, 1945, he was informed that the final attack to save Berlin had failed. He declared that everything is lost and announced he would shoot himself, which he did on April 30, 1945. Germany now faced wholesale destruction, a condition characterized by the term Stunde Null.
0 hour.
0 hour.
So following the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich, Germany was politically dismembered and territorially reduced. The first consequence of defeat was this massive territorial loss and the largest forced population shift in modern European history.
Following the Potsdam Conference, Germany was stripped of all its wartime gains, and over a quarter of its pre-war territory was annexed. The territories east of the Oder-Neisse line were transferred to Poland and the Soviet Union, and this necessitated a massive, often brutal demographic relocation.
The expulsion of ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe remains a deeply traumatic event.
Around 12 million ethnic Germans were expelled from across Eastern Europe, primarily from Poland and Czechoslovakia. The process was often violent and disorganized. The sources describe severe mistreatment, where many, mostly women and children, died in forced labor camps or starved and froze to death during the expulsions in transit. This flood of refugees profoundly impacted the political and social landscape of what was left of Germany.
By 1949, the country was formally split into two separate states, reflecting the emerging Cold War divide.
On May 23, 1949, the U.S., British, and French occupation zones were combined to form the Federal Republic of Germany, or FRG, which we know as West Germany. It established its capital in Bonn, and the FRG rapidly aligned itself with the West, becoming a founding member of the European Economic Community, the EEC, in 1951.
But what about denazification in the West? Was there a genuine cleansing of the state apparatus?
Denazification was an Allied mandate, but it proved to be hugely unpopular in West Germany, which was focused entirely on reconstruction. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's new government openly opposed many aspects of the continuing effort.
So former Nazis got back into positions of power.
Following amnesties that were passed after 1951, many individuals with former Nazi affiliations were able to return to positions of authority, particularly in the judiciary and the civil service. This really complicates any notion of a total institutional fresh start.
And in the East?
The Soviet zone established the German Democratic Republic, or GDR East Germany, as a Stalinist Eastern Bloc state and a founding member of the Warsaw Pact.
So the establishment of the GDR was directed by these veteran communists favored by Moscow, particularly Walter Ulbricht. What was his strategy for control?
Ulbricht was a leading KPD functionary, and he directed all the party activity. And while the initial KPD program of June 1945 called for private industry in a democratic republic, Ulbricht's operating mantra was pragmatic and incredibly cynical. He said, "It's got to look democratic, but we must have everything in our control."
So it was a facade.
Completely. Trusted veteran communists were installed in all the key posts to ensure the Soviet model of a one-party state was implemented from the start.
Economically, East Germany faced these severe immediate burdens compared to the West's Marshall Plan aid.
The GDR was heavily burdened. It was an exporter of reparations goods to the USSR, which crippled its ability to invest in its own infrastructure and consumer goods. By 1953, the economic conditions were dire, and the ruling SED party decided to squeeze the industrial workers even harder.
How did they do that?
After failing to persuade workers to voluntarily accept higher quotas, the government just announced a compulsory 10% increase in work norms in May 1953.
And this compulsory increase triggered the eruption of the Forgotten Workers' Rebellion.
The fury over this forced increase was immediate and widespread. Construction workers on Berlin's Stalinallee went on strike, demanding a lowering of the norms. And this rapidly incited strikes in 250 towns and cities across the entire GDR, involving between 300,000 and 400,000 workers.
I think it's vital to clarify the goals of this 1953 uprising. Was it seeking capitalism or unification?
Historians largely define it as, first and foremost, a workers' uprising against Stalinism. It was aimed at rescinding the quotas, demanding political reforms and democratic transformation, but within a socialist framework. It was not about destroying socialism entirely.
So it was a demand for economic justice and democratic reform.
Yes, but the ruling SED regime had no intention of ceding power, and the uprising was brutally suppressed by overwhelming numbers of heavily armed Soviet forces.
What was the fallout of that suppression?
Over 250 strikers were killed by Soviet troops. The subsequent arrests targeted the core group. At least 70% of those who were arrested and imprisoned were workers. The event was devastating. It confirmed to the populace that the regime was a repressive dictatorship that was only maintained by Soviet power, and that directly influences the next major political event, the construction of the Berlin Wall.
Right. The ultimate admission of the regime's failure to retain its own population came in 1961.
By August 1961, the GDR had lost a massive 1/6 of its entire population, at least 4 million people, to migration, mostly young, educated, and skilled workers.
And Berlin was the last hole in the fence.
Since the internal border with West Germany had been heavily fortified since 1952, the sector borders in Berlin remained the last open crossing point. So the GDR government, supported by the Soviet Union, built the Berlin Wall in August 1961. And tragically, the order to shoot people attempting to flee, the Schießbefehl, was maintained for decades. It wasn't lifted until April 1989.
In stark contrast to the repressive and economically struggling East, the FRG in the West experienced the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle.
This recovery began with the currency reform in mid-1948, but its underlying strength came from several factors. It was greatly accelerated by U.S. Marshall Plan aid, but also by the adoption of ordoliberalism, a form of social market economy championed by economics minister Ludwig Erhard.
So what did that mean in practice?
It combined free markets with a strong social safety net. Furthermore, Germany benefited from its retained industrial capacity after the war and the influx of highly motivated, skilled labor from the expelled ethnic Germans and later the Gastarbeiter, the guest workers.
The post-war political environment, dominated by Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, was remarkably stable. But it didn't mean a return to old authoritarian deference. The 1960s saw profound challenges to government authority.
The Der Spiegel affair in 1962 was a seismic event. The news magazine published a highly critical analysis detailing weaknesses in West Germany's military defense system. The defense minister, Franz Josef Strauss, reacted by ordering a police raid on the magazine's offices and arresting editors on charges of treason.
That seems like a massive overreach that would test a young democracy. What was the public reaction?
The public outcry was immense. Intellectuals, students, liberals, they saw it as a gross violation of freedom of the press and an authoritarian act that was inherited from the Weimar or even the Nazi era.
So it was a turning point.
A huge turning point. It moved Germany away from these old authoritarian deep state values toward genuine democratic accountability. The pressure forced the resignation of multiple cabinet ministers and ultimately impaired Adenauer's own reputation, forcing him to step down the following year. It proved that West German democracy had resilience and a capacity for self-correction.
And the late 60s saw further challenges from the militant student movement.
Students mobilized against the Vietnam War and, crucially, against the perceived conservatism and repression at home. They reacted strongly to the actions of the conservative press, particularly the Bild Zeitung newspaper, which waged this mass campaign labeling protesters as hooligans.
And there was a key event that radicalized them.
The death of a student named Benno Ohnesorg in 1967. He was shot by a plainclothed policeman who was later revealed to be an East German Stasi spy. The movement critically questioned the role of their parents' generation during the Nazi era and demanded greater transparency.
And this cultural and political dynamism eventually led to the diplomatic strategy that attempted to bridge the German division, Ostpolitik.
Beginning in 1969, under Chancellor Willy Brandt, the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, adopted Ostpolitik. It sought to improve relations with the Eastern Bloc while remaining rooted firmly in the Western Alliance. The foundational concept was accepting the reality of two German states in one German nation.
And this led to normalization.
It did. Most importantly, the Basic Treaty of 1972, and both East and West Germany joined the United Nations in 1973. They formally acknowledged each other's existence, which was a massive shift from the FRG's previous policy of total non-recognition.
So the collapse of the East German government in 1989 was astonishingly swift and really largely unexpected by the world's major powers. What was the first catalyst for the peaceful revolution?
The failure of the SED regime became irreversible in May 1989, when Hungary removed its border fence with Austria. This just opened a huge hole in the Iron Curtain.
And that allowed an immediate, massive exodus.
Thousands of East Germans fled to West Germany via Hungary and Austria. This brain drain just destabilized the regime beyond any hope of repair.
That flow turned into a torrent, and that led to massive civil protests.
Escalating protests across the GDR, the Peaceful Revolution, which culminated in the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989. It was actually a bureaucratic blunder that led to the immediate opening of the border crossings.
And after that, things moved very quickly.
The GDR held its first free elections in March 1990. On August 23, 1990, the Volkskammer, the East German parliament, declared the Beitritt, the accession of the German Democratic Republic to the Federal Republic of Germany.
So unification was essentially the West German Basic Law just being extended eastward, and that became effective on October 3rd, 1990. But the international community, particularly France and Britain, had immediate serious concerns.
Major concerns. Both French President Mitterrand and Prime Minister Thatcher expressed significant alarm about the rapid, seemingly unchecked rise of a united Germany. Mitterrand, fearing Germany's historical fluidity, famously worried that a unified Germany could make more ground than even Adolf had, reclaiming former Eastern territories and dominating Eastern Europe.
But they couldn't stop the momentum?
No. Both leaders were eventually reassured and realized they couldn't stop it.
And full international sovereignty was crucial to completing this unification process.
It was formalized via the Treaty on the Final Settlement with respect to Germany, known as the 2+4 Treaty. It was signed in September 1990 by the 2 German states and the 4 Allied powers, the US, UK, France, and the USSR. This treaty formally granted full sovereignty to the reunified state, ending all remaining limitations from the post-WWII occupation. The final step was re-establishing Berlin as the seat of government, signaling the full national return of the capital.
So, politically unified, Germany now faced the massive challenge of economic convergence. The expectation was that the East would catch up to the West very quickly, but the sources indicate a persistent, stubborn economic gap.
This is a persistent and stark reality. It's often referred to as the Mauer im Kopf, the wall in the head. East Germany remains consistently 20 to 25% poorer per capita than West Germany, with the lone exception of Berlin.
So even the poorest West German states are still wealthier.
Still wealthier per capita than all of the East German states. And while the quality of life dramatically improved in the East, the promised full economic parity just failed to materialize. This was largely due to differences in infrastructure, property ownership, and the immediate closure of uncompetitive East German industries after unification.
And the success of individuals within the East was heavily dependent on pre-existing social ties, which underscores the lack of a level playing field.
Research clearly shows this. Those East German households who already had prior social ties to the West, a relative who lived there, for example, or a contact for business, they saw their household income increase at a positive rate in the 6 years following reunification. Those who lacked those ties did not see that benefit.
So social capital, not just industrial capital, was the crucial factor for economic success after 1990.
It was a huge factor, yes.
Politically, modern Germany took on its role as an economic engine of Europe. Angela Merkel became the first female chancellor in 2005, and Germany has been instrumental in European integration, co-founding the Eurozone.
And internationally, Germany moved away from its post-war aversion to military engagement. It deployed peacekeeping forces in the Balkans and NATO troops in Afghanistan, recognizing its responsibilities as a major global power. Its armed forces, the Bundeswehr, include the Army, Navy, Air Force, and now the Cyber and Information Domain Service.
And the most dramatic recent shift involves military posture, a fundamental strategic pivot in response to the massive external threat posed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced this as the Zeitenwende, a turning point in history. He declared that German military expenditure would be increased past the NATO target of 2% of GDP, along with a one-time special infusion of 100 billion euros dedicated to military modernization.
This is a profound shift from decades of military restraint.
It is. And in 2024, Germany officially reported that its military spending reached 2.12% of GDP, exceeding the NATO target for the first time in decades.
This really marks the definitive end of the post-Cold War security profile and a return to the kind of great power military considerations we haven't seen in Germany since before World War I.
It connects directly to the historical tension we've discussed all through this deep dive. Germany, having been defined by its strategic vulnerability and the catastrophic nature of its past military engagements, is now choosing, rapidly and decisively, to rearm in response to a geopolitical threat. And that's forcing the nation to confront its past military legacy in a very direct way.
So we've traveled from Julius Caesar defining the tribes of Germania as the unconquered. We watched the rise and division of the Frankish Empire, seen religious revolution tear the lands apart in the devastating 30 Years' War, and witnessed the turbulent military unification under Bismarck's iron and blood.
Then the catastrophic fall into Sixtunden Null Zero Hour and the 45 years of division, followed by the unexpected peaceful reunification.
What's truly remarkable across this entire timeline is this persistent tension between internal fragmentation, Duke versus Emperor, Catholic versus Protestant, East versus West, and this desperate, often military-driven push for a singular identity.
The defining feature of German history, in a way, is often this critical self-evaluation that follows utter destruction. That's what stood null really characterized after WWII.
It's striking that the most significant early anti-authoritarian uprising we discussed, the East German Revolt of 1953, was fundamentally driven by ordinary workers fighting Stalinist economic quotas. It was a demand for economic fairness and a functioning state, not just ideological purity.
And that raises a really important question for the present day, especially given Germany's dramatic Zeitenwende military pivot and the lingering economic reality we just talked about.
Right.
We noted that East Germany is still substantially poorer than the West, and that the economic benefits of reunification were often dependent on pre-existing ties. So considering that the 1953 uprising was fundamentally a demand for economic justice, how might the persistent economic and cultural disparities still existing between East and West Germany influence the nation's ability to unite behind major, expensive national projects, like this significant military shift or the ongoing green energy transition, the Energiewende?
Can a country launch such fundamental national projects while these deep structural and economic divisions persist?
It's a tension that echoes throughout German history, and it's something to think about as you navigate today's complex European headlines.